Everything just felt like an incremental improvement to me, whereas Bitcoin did not feel like an incremental improvement. It was like a step function, and you could tell that if this thing really takes off, it could have like a massive impact. But I still think that the ideal design space is actually what we're working on right now, which is Bitcoin L2s. Like Bitcoin L2s give you the design space to have the full VM or have the new types of functionality that you want without modifying Bitcoin L1.
Welcome to The Blueprint, the show where we interview the innovators behind some of Web3's most exciting projects and learn about who they are, where they're from, and where they're going. The Blueprint is designed to be accessible to crypto natives and noobs alike. So if you're new on your crypto journey, we'd be honored if you start exploring with us. The Blueprint is a collaboration between XD Academy and the Spartan Group. I'm Lawrence, an entrepreneur and career educator with a passion for making complex ideas simple. Today, we'll be talking to Muneeb Ali, co-creator of Stacks Protocol. If you're interested in Bitcoin and following the rise of ordinals and BRC20 and just kind of new things to be done on the Bitcoin blockchain in general, you are definitely going to be interested in this conversation. Stacks is an OG crypto project that seems to be taking on new life in the new current narrative, and is also releasing some incredible developments that I think are worth learning about. This was one of my favorite conversations that we've had on The Blueprint. This was recorded on December 21st, 2023. I hope you enjoy. Muneeb, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us and for making the time. So for those of our audience that may not be familiar with you, would you mind introducing yourself very briefly?
Sure. So I'm Muneeb. I'm the co-creator of Stacks, which is a Bitcoin L2. I've been in the Bitcoin space for around 10 years now, started in 2013. Before that, I was a grad student at Princeton. I was doing my PhD in computer science.
Very cool. 2013, that's got to be one of the earliest beginnings I've heard of, certainly from anyone I've interviewed in the podcast. Tell me about what was Bitcoin like in 2013?
I think it was a pretty exciting time. And it's interesting that people who joined like even 1 or 2 years earlier actually experienced something very different from what I did. Right. So 2013 is like, think of that as a bull market of 2017 or the bull market of 2021. So I joined in the quote unquote bull market of 2013, and there was already a class of Bitcoiners and people who have gone through learnings in 2012, 2011, and they really felt like OGs at that point. And in some ways they still do, right? Like they have one more cycle on them. But it's really interesting. It was obviously a very, very small world back then. I remember like meetups in New York. Like I think we started the first altcoin meetup. Like it was basically that community didn't exist, and we were like, okay, there can be other experiments. For example, there was the first fork of Bitcoin was Namecoin, and it used the Bitcoin code base, and it was trying to add different functionality for having domain names. And I think that type of stuff interested me. That hey, what else can you do, especially with Bitcoin? And that's sort of like the early days. And the interesting thing that I've noticed is that a lot of people from you can even almost think of that as a class, like the class of 2013. They still stay in touch, and there's like this bond that we have that hey, we sort of like started the same year, and we've seen the ups and downs for the last 10 years.
Muneeb, what's interesting is it sounds to me like we may have heard about Bitcoin around the same time. So I was in grad school as well, and I remember there was some excitement. The more sort of tech-oriented members of my class were talking about Bitcoin having reached parity with the dollar. I think this must have been like 2012 that this happened. And and I said, well, what's Bitcoin? And they started explaining, well, it's this digital money thing, blah, blah, blah. And the idea was very interesting to me, but I didn't immediately say, hey, I've got to really, really go deep on this thing. What do you suppose was the difference for you that made you say, hey, I might make my whole life about this?
Yeah. So I think the interesting thing was that 2013 was supposed to be the year that I finished my PhD, but I was getting much more interested in doing startups. So I took a leave from the university, and with my co-founder Ryan, that I met at Princeton as well, we were trying to basically start a company, and we were hacking on different ideas. So we were like working out of a co-working spot in New York. And interestingly, all the ideas that we were trying initially, they had nothing to do with Bitcoin. But we were just so excited about Bitcoin, and we'll talk so much about Bitcoin, that everyone in the co-working place thought that we were a Bitcoin company. And that was kind of like a funny thing, that it was like, that Paul Graham has this quote that, whatever people work on their nights and weekends is the actual interesting stuff. And it was happening to us, like while we were trying to, experiment with like more traditional tech startups, we were just getting dragged into Bitcoin because it was from a technical perspective, from how early it was, like it was just a fascinating world. And interestingly, it was the people around us who started saying that, hey, you guys seem really excited about this Bitcoin thing. Why don't you take it more seriously? And me and Ryan were like, actually, why not? Right? Like let's try and dig deeper and see what we can build here. So that was sort of like an interesting beginning. So I would say, thinking back, for me personally, I think being a computer scientist and seeing sort of like the peer-to-peer network of Bitcoin and some of the fundamental computer science problems that it was solving for the first time, like that was really exciting. And it was, to me, it was like my imagination of what the early internet would have looked like, right? Like when it was small. And because one of the reasons why I think I got a little discouraged by academia during my PhD was everything felt like an incremental improvement, right? Like it felt like a lot of the really groundbreaking things have already been done, like in the 90s and so on. So everything just felt like an incremental improvement to me, whereas Bitcoin did not feel like an incremental improvement. It was like a step function, and you could tell that if this thing really takes off, it could have like a massive impact on the world. And I think that was the thing that was really exciting. One other thing I would point out, that the actual Bitcoin as money, or Bitcoin as hard money, even I picked it up like a couple of years later, right? Like, sure, I was buying some Bitcoin for fun. Like I would always feel like over $100, like, it's too expensive. I would only buy under 100. And I was getting pretty interested in it, but I was looking at it almost like a tech stock, that it's like an early tech investment. And it took me a couple of years to really understand the monetary aspect of Bitcoin and the hard money aspect, which actually like really changed my view. And I started looking at Bitcoin more as a savings technology, that it's the BTC, the asset, that's probably the most important thing. So it almost like flipped, right? Like initially I was more interested in Bitcoin, the technology. And then Bitcoin, the asset, actually became the primary thing. And Bitcoin, the technology, is actually something that you could like, iterate over or slowly improve over time. And that ended up being the work that I'm doing now, which we can get into later.
Yeah, there's so much to get into. That's interesting here. First, I got to ask, what was the original plan? Was it career academia?
Yeah, so I think I remember just like being fascinated with computers the first time I saw them. I had to like beg my parents to get me one, and I forget exactly what the requirements were, but it was something about if you get certain grades, then we will get you one. Because like, I mean, these things were expensive. I come from a pretty humble background in Pakistan, and my parents, they used up their savings to buy me a computer, and I was like probably the only kid on the block who had one, right? And it was a pretty exciting time. And I remember just staying up like all nights on the computer, and then I would wake up like in a pretty, not a good shape. And my parents were like, this thing is not good for you. Like you're getting addicted or something. And then finally, the first time I went online, this was late 90s. That was again a completely different experience, right? Like for me, like a kid growing up in a small town in Pakistan and suddenly having access to the internet and globally connecting to the rest of the planet and discovering, all sorts of new information, connecting with new people. It was just a fascinating time. So that's where, for me, like, I do think I was always the type of person where it's not that I'm a user of the computer or the user of the internet. I would very quickly start looking under the hood and starting to play around with things. Like Like a small example would be that, back in the days, IRC was the thing. It was like the chat thing. It's like, you can even think of it as like the old school Twitter, right? Like that's where everyone was.
I
And
think we
so,
might be about the same age because I remember IRC as
yes,
well. But yeah, but for the benefit of our millennial and Gen Z listeners, yes.
yeah,
Please
it's
continue.
it's it's sort of like the old age Twitter, right? Like that's where everyone was. You had these chat rooms and people would talk there, and you would have these usernames, right? Like that people would know you as. And I could have been just a user of IRC, but I very quickly started sort of like running my own servers and like trying to figure out like how does the protocol work. And I think that's sort of like the difference, where you could either be same with operating systems, right? Like I threw away Windows from my computer very quickly because I realized I can't modify it. And I started installing Linux. I started, messing around with some of the code to to change things. And I think that's the difference. That's the primary difference. That are you a user of the computer, or are you trying to actually
Mm.
build the things? And I think that's where my interest started. And even in undergrad, I was really interested in computer science, and that changed into research. I believe in my second year or third year in my undergrad, and I was pretty interested in like, hey, I want to do like R&D work. Like that feels like being on the cutting edge. And my journey with academia is interested. Like I was like interested in just that and nothing else. And then I got into a really good PhD program, which I'm very grateful for, and met all these almost like idols and gods, right? Like imagine this guy Larry Peterson, who wrote the book on computer networks that uh, I I learned from in my undergrad. And now Larry Peterson is like sitting across the hall and saying hi to you in grad school. And he's I thought of him as like a god of computer networking, right? And interestingly, while I'm so grateful for the grad school program and the PhD research I did, my time there also opened up my eyes that um, commercial stuff is what I am more interested in, right?
Mm.
Instead of more pure R&D. Like you could be working on interesting problems, you build up these solutions, but somehow they feel more disconnected from reality to me. Doesn't mean all of the research is. I think some of the research does get commercialized. So I
Mhm.
became more and more interested in, let's call it less theory, more practical stuff, right? Like, but there always needs to be that like cutting edge aspect where you're just doing R&D on the next best thing. But I don't want to leave it as an idea in a research lab or just publish it. Like I want to take
Mhm.
it to production. I want to actually have an impact uh, on the world through a real system. And I think that's the thing that differentiated. Where by the time that I was towards the end of my PhD, I almost was pretty sure that I'm just not interested in publishing research papers. Right? I'd much rather
Mm.
build something and that a lot of people are using, and that's real validation that this idea actually had legs. Versus, let's say, publishing in a top tier conference, which is like self-referential, right? Like your peers thought that this was a good idea, but that's about it. Not that the market thought that this was a really good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all grateful that people with your kind of aptitude decide to be creators rather than just work in the purely theoretical kind of way. So I guess maybe transport me to your mindset at around this period. You're really interested in startups. You found someone that you want to work with, and you're both kind of being drawn into this. Like, you know what? Maybe this Bitcoin thing is the thing. How did you guys sort of hone in on the attack point that you guys wanted to focus on?
So I do think like having the right partner is really important because it makes the journey more fun, right? So Ryan is this amazingly intelligent, amazingly creative person who's like just so excited about ideas. It's kind of funny that in my previous sort of like roles or groups that I've been in, like research groups and stuff, I'm usually the ideas person, where I'm like, hey, like here's a new way of doing this thing. And while working with Ryan, like it was like I had to like stop him from from coming up with new ideas. I'm like, dude, come on, like he's so excited and he's churning out new ideas at a very high speed. And I'm the one who has to be more pessimistic and like, no, let's not look at that. Like, look at this or look at that. It was a very, very interesting sort of thing. And then we were both engineers. We were both hackers, right? So we would, it's not like we we're just talking about these things. We're actually building them. And in a very small team, you can actually iterate very, very fast, right? So I think the first sort of design decision that we made, the high level idea was that Bitcoin could also be a platform, right? Like it's not just about the existing payment rails and BTC, the asset, but you can actually build other types of applications on top, right? Which I think is the most successful example of that idea is actually Ethereum and Vitalik. And we were probably like a year or a year and a half before that. And I think the difference that we had, that we were trying to hack on Bitcoin, and we looked at the options that, hey, should we start a different chain? And we thought that that would be an uphill battle. Like, why don't you just use the existing infrastructure that Bitcoin has instead of starting a separate chain? But it turns out that starting a separate chain actually gives you more freedom, and you can maybe break away from some of the limitations that are there for Bitcoin script, right? So Ethereum actually showed the path of like how to do it. But I still think that the ideal design space is actually what we're working on right now, which is Bitcoin L2s. Like Bitcoin L2s give you the design space to have the full VM or have the new types of functionality that you want without modifying Bitcoin L1. But then you have this really tight connection with Bitcoin, and you can benefit from BTC, the asset, which is the primary asset in our industry, and I think it has the highest chances of success as winning as money. So that's, I think, is the best of both worlds. Like, so that idea of like Bitcoin L2s, I think we were circulating it. We weren't like fully, it wasn't like very visible at that time. And we were basically trying to just work on the Bitcoin L1. And I think that was a pretty big like fork in the road, where the stuff that we were doing, it was pretty much limited by Bitcoin script, what you could do, the scalability of Bitcoin, versus building something separate as like Ethereum. What at that time turned out to be the better design decision, I think. But coming back, like even this year, if you notice like how much attention is coming back to Bitcoin, and now we know that the path forward was not just like, hey, try to do something with the L1, but actually build a L2 on top. And I think that's what the Stacks project is, which started in around like 2017. Before that, we were just building like applications and interesting protocols on Bitcoin L1 directly.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about this. But maybe just bringing it back to that time period. So you guys, I guess, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like you were disappointed with some of the limitations of what you could do with the Bitcoin network. A lot of the features that Ethereum would soon implement, you guys were thinking about a way to implement on the Bitcoin network. And then how did that sort of, tell me what actions took place from there. What did you guys actually do? I know you've had a tremendous amount of success in your career. You've been able to raise a lot of money. You've built incredible projects. Walk me through maybe from this phase of like, okay, we got to help the Bitcoin network be better, to, what happened after that.
Yeah. So I think I would divide the work we have done into two eras. Like one is before 2017, which is on the Bitcoin L1. And then late 2017 is when Stacks started, which is like, it was almost like crystal clear in 2017 that things on Bitcoin are going to scale as L2s. Like it was like just a writings on the wall, no chance that, you can do anything on the L1. And I think that's when Lightning started. That's when Stacks started. So I'll separate that out. So before that, when it's not clear, imagine this is before the block size war, right? Like this is Ethereum was like very small. Ethereum just launched in like maybe late 2015, early 2016, and a lot of people were very skeptical of it at that time. And so in this world, we are looking at Bitcoin L1, trying to see what type of things you can build. So one protocol that we built is called BNS, the Bitcoin name system. So it's still alive. Have you seen people like with the .eth in their Twitter handle?
Sure,
right.
Of course.
So that's ENS built on Ethereum. but BNS actually predates that, right? BNS came before ENS, and it's the people with the .btc names on Twitter. Like there are still a significant number of those registrations, like around 250,000 or something. But I agree that ENS is more popular, more mainstream than BNS at this time. But historically, BNS came first, right? And it was built on Bitcoin by us, and it's still alive. Still, people use it, and a lot of people are very excited about it. So that was one project that we built, and now once we built the Stacks L2 later on, BNS sort of like lives on the L2 as well, right? So we're in the process of figuring out like how to make it more seamless, the connection between the L1 and the L2. But that's one thing. The other thing that we did was almost like early decentralized applications. All right. So one thing that we built almost as to showcase, BNS names, we built this about.me like website. It was called One Name. And I think that was the first sort of like decentralized application that got like traction in the community. We got like maybe 100,000, 200,000 users on it. The quote unquote who's who of crypto was on it, right? Like Winklevoss brothers, Vitalik, like the different Bitcoin core devs. Like I think a lot of people, that was their first interaction with a decentralized application, right? Like where they could create like a about.me profile, they could verify themselves on Twitter, and so on. And interestingly, when that app was taking off in the early days, a lot of Bitcoin core devs weren't happy with us. They were like, these people are spamming the chain. Like Bitcoin is not meant for these types of applications. Almost imagine the type of reaction you're seeing to ordinals today, a very early version of that, right? So at some point, I think we were doing like 40% of Bitcoin traffic, which is like, if you think about it, if a block has like 1,000 transactions, if you're generating 400 transactions, you're doing 40% of the traffic, right? So it sounds like a bigger thing than it actually is. But like we were getting a lot of pushback, right? And the thing where I would say the limitations of Bitcoin, both in terms of speed and transaction fees, like in 2017, transaction fees spiked a lot, right? And it was very clear that we would never be able to register like tens of millions of these users through either the app or the protocol directly. And that's where I think Bitcoin L2 started to emerge as like something which are clearly needed, and the L1 is not going to scale. And the camp that thought that L1 can scale, they actually forked into Bcash, Bitcoin Cash, and that has sort of like disappeared since then. I think all of these Bitcoin forks have less than 1% of Bitcoin market cap. So the idea that, hey, Bitcoin just the L1 can scale, now I don't think there's a lot of contention around it, and all the focus is on Bitcoin L2s.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about Bitcoin L2s then. What's a Bitcoin L2?
Yes. So I think it's an interesting thing in the definition as well, because the term actually started in Bitcoin way back, right? Like, so the Liquid network by Blockstream is probably the first one that used the term. That came around in like 2014 or so. This is before even Ethereum existed, right? So Bitcoin L2 is typically something that is trying to use BTC asset, right? Like, and they can have different security models. Some security models make it more like a side chain. Some security models make it closer to a L2 or what the commonly accepted definition of an L2 is today. So Lightning, for example, is much closer to what people think of L2s in the Ethereum world, because most of the security properties are coming from the Bitcoin L1 directly. You can always withdraw your BTC from Lightning and go back to L1. There aren't a lot of trust assumptions there. There's some attacks that can happen, but generally speaking, there aren't a lot of trust assumptions, right? Whereas Liquid is sort of like a federated network, and you're totally dependent on the signers, the multi-sig signers, Blockstream and a couple of their partners, for getting your BTC back. Right. So you can almost see on a spectrum that on one side, Lightning is very trustless. And on one side, there's a lot of trust assumption in the federation. Right. So the bunch of L2s that are coming up on Ethereum, they are usually more trustless. Right. So where someone only needs to trust the ETH L1 to withdraw their assets back to the L1. And the reason for that is that Ethereum is more programmable. So you can actually have that type of logic running at the L1, where the smart contract can actually enforce that your assets come out of the L2 and back to the L1. Bitcoin doesn't have that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what Stacks is doing is that's saying, okay, Bitcoin is not going to change, but what's the best product, or what's the best L2 that we can ship today, and then keep minimizing the trust assumptions over time, maybe to the point when Bitcoin can support a few of these new opcodes and it can become like fully trustless and so on. So the thing that we're launching in the next 2-3 months is a massive upgrade to Stack. So the Stack started late 2017, a couple of years of R&D, and the mainnet went live in early 2021. And then for the last 2 years, the decentralized ecosystem, people have been working on a massive upgrade for Stacks, which is scheduled to go live in the next 3 months or so before the Bitcoin halving. And over there, one of the core things is this movement of BTC from L1 to L2. And the trust assumption is that people who are locking STX capital and consensus and earning Bitcoin rewards, they're the ones who sign when BTC goes back from the L2 to the L1. Right? So it's a little bit like, if you look at the validators in Ethereum, like they're the ones who are signing the blocks. Over here, these quote unquote signers or validators, they sign when your BTC goes back to L1. And the reason is that Bitcoin L1 doesn't have the opcodes to support this. But there are some interesting new approaches, like BitVM is a new thing on the Bitcoin L1, where even without modifying Bitcoin L1, you can actually reduce the trust assumptions even more. And we can get into that. But I think at a high level, think of this as Stacks wants to ship the Bitcoin L2, where moving BTC would be fast, like 5-second blocks. It would be cheap. And then you have a full VM. Like any program, if you want to build a DEX, if you want to build a liquidity protocol, whatever it is, you can build these things, but the asset will be BTC that is used everywhere. People can pay even gas fees in BTC. There's a proposal around it. So the UX for user is going to look like, okay, on L1, BTC is sort of like slow and expensive. And if I move it to L2, BTC can be faster and cheaper, but obviously it's safer to use the L1. Right. So I think the analogy that I would want like normal retail users to have is L1 is more like cold storage. Keep your assets there. Right. And just like when you move like some assets into a hot wallet, and hot wallet is less secure, but you need to move it to a hot wallet if you want to do something proactive. If you want to play around with NFTs or some new protocol or app, you need to move your assets to a hot wallet. Not cold storage is not going to do that. So I think that's how I look at L2, that if you want to do something productive with your BTC, if you want to deploy it into a liquidity pool, or you want to go around and trade it for like stable coins or whatever, you will first move it to the L2, because that's where more functionality is. That's where it's faster and cheaper to use BTC.
This is super interesting. And this is one of those projects that the more you learn about, you just feel like the applications for it would just be limitless, right? And I think that Bitcoin really remains the gold standard, and it's the asset everybody wants, right? Yeah. It's like you'd rather deal with Bitcoin than anything else. Wow, that's very cool. So I'm not a computer scientist, and my very dumb brain, what I think I heard you say is that it sounds like you're sort of building a proof of stake network on top of the proof of work Bitcoin network. Is that fair to say? Is that how you keep the validators sort of?
Yeah, I would say it's directionally correct, but technically the details are a little bit different. Maybe I can get into that a little bit.
Yeah, please.
So basically, I think in a proof of stake network like Ethereum, there's basically one set of actors, right? Like it's the validators. They're producing the blocks, they're signing it, and that's how it works. So over here, there are two sets of actors. One are what we call sequencers or miners, right? So they are effectively the block producers. And these actors, they actually operate on the Bitcoin L1. So they are bidding in BTC. So that's a very interesting property of Stacks as well. That it's basically reusing Bitcoin's hash power and BTC, the asset. right? So the bids are happening in BTC. As like, let me take a step back. Imagine that if you're a Bitcoin miner, the L1 miner, you are consuming electricity, right? And you have some probability of winning a Bitcoin block. So you're sort of converting like physical energy into hash power, and you're earning BTC. That's why I think Bitcoin has a very clear value in the world, because people are actually spending energy, like real energy, to actually obtain Bitcoin. So it's like Bitcoin becomes like almost like a digitally stored energy, right? Like that's how you can look at it, and people can see how it's valuable. But once you have Bitcoin, you no longer have to do the proof of work, because you already have BTC, which is stored energy in a way, right? So for the L2, to produce the blocks, people are just bidding in BTC. So this is like, people spending electricity and having a probability of winning a block. Over here, you're spending your BTC and you have a probability of winning a L2 block, right? So if you win that L2 block, you get the rewards in that L2 block. So that's how, like, we call them sequencers, because they're really just sequencing the transactions. They can't reorg the L2. So with the new system, basically what happens is that you can have 5-second transactions on the L2, and then I'll explain like where the security of that is coming from. But as soon as a Bitcoin block comes, all of those blocks are going to settle on Bitcoin L1, right? So if you did a transaction on Bitcoin L1, the security property is that only the Bitcoin miners can reorg, right? Or someone has to hack the network and then reorg the chain, and Bitcoin is like the most secure chain out there. So the way we have designed the system is that once your L2 transaction gets a 1 Bitcoin confirmation, then it's the same thing. Like for someone to come and reorg it, they will have to attack the Bitcoin miners and change the Bitcoin L1 chain. And I think that's a very strong security property to have. That even if a user is doing a L2 transaction, so imagine a user has a choice that you could either transfer your BTC on the L1 or the L2. And even if you transfer it on the L2, you will get a very fast confirmation. But then as soon as a Bitcoin block comes, the security property, at least in terms of reorging the chain, is the same. So I think that's very interesting. So where do the second set of actors come in? So miners and our sequencers operate at the L1 level, and then there are actors that operate at the L2 level. We call them stackers, right? Because not really staking, but you do lock up capital. So these people, what they're doing is that they are the ones. So right now there's $500 million locked up right now in stacks. So these people who have locked this capital, they earn BTC rewards. So STX is a very unique asset where if you're participating in consensus, you can actually earn BTC as a reward out of it. And the yield is around like 6% these days. And like hundreds of millions in BTC have gone out in the last like couple of years to these people. And their job is, they have 2 jobs. One, they're responsible for these fast blocks, right? So when the fast blocks are coming, they sign on them, right? So before a Bitcoin block comes, the security property is that, hey, this $500 million of capital has actually signed off that this was a valid block. So people can't really reverse it without messing around with all these quote unquote validators, right? So that part would appear to people like proof of stake, right? That these people are capital locked and they have signed off, but they don't have the ability to do anything long term, right? It's only for a small period of time in between 2 Bitcoin blocks that they sign off on transactions, and then when the Bitcoin block comes, then the finality is just
that's it. Bitcoin. It's a clean slate. It's a clean slate. Yeah, got it. Clean slate.
They don't have a lot of power on the network, which is the criticism of proof of stake, that, hey, people who are rich, like they can basically do anything they want on the network, right? Over there, the maximum power they have is maybe they can try to mess around with in a very small time window. But interestingly, on stacks, an interesting property is that if you think that you're being censored or whatever is happening to you, you can just broadcast your transactions on the L1, and then it will be forced included in the L2, because we always have Bitcoin. We always have Bitcoin main chain, right? So if you feel like you're being censored on the L2, you can just use the L1. And I think that's a very interesting censorship resistance property that we have. That if Bitcoin is the gold standard for security, we want to be, as secure as Bitcoin. If Bitcoin is the gold standard for censorship resistance, we want to be as censorship resistant as Bitcoin. And I think those are really interesting properties. And the biggest thing here is that BTC is the asset that will get used everywhere, right? And Bitcoin is like $800 billion of capital. Even if you can mobilize like 1% or 2% of BTC, like that's like tens of billions of capital, which is bigger than any all L1s, right? So I think this is
probably over $1 trillion by the time this airs, but
yeah.
Go on, yeah.
So I think that's what we're trying to do. Where, in my mind, the calculation was a little bit like this: that we know Bitcoin, the asset, is going to be successful, right? The downside of this approach is that you need to build a lot of infrastructure around Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's existing like dev tools and libraries and infrastructure isn't in a great shape, right? For various historical reasons. I think Ethereum and even some newer chains like Solana, they might have better dev tooling. But that to me is a purely engineering question. It's a purely a question of like raising capital, hiring good engineers, and letting them build the tools and the thing, right? It's not a fundamental thing. Yeah,
I want to dig in on that a little bit, because again, I'm not an engineer, but the way I've had it explained to me in the past has always made it sound more fundamental. So maybe before we go a little deeper on this, as deep as my technical abilities will allow me, I need to ask you, Muneeb, and I hope that you'll just be very honest with me. Are you a Bitcoin maxi?
I think Bitcoin maxis, or at least a large subset of them, they actually frequently argue with me and they don't like what I'm doing. But I think some of them are actually slowly coming around. So I would think of myself as a Bitcoin monetary maxi, right? In terms of the asset, like BTC, I would die on that hill. I think that asset is better than any other asset. Like I found this entire thing around, ETH for the last 2-3 years was trying to build this narrative that ETH is ultra sound money, and it just doesn't land with me, right? Like it just does not. The network is not designed. This is not how it was launched. This was not what it was meant to be. Like, for example, imagine the changes that were made to Ethereum just last year, which the Ethereum community celebrated those changes, right? Like they've changed how ETH is being burned and the supply is going to go down and all of that. But the fact that it changed, that's the point. Bitcoin is not going to change. That is the type of durability. That is the type of stability that you want. I'll give you another example, right? I'm from the class of 2013. I can dust up a Bitcoin software release from 2013, like literally from 10 years ago. I can run that software, and today it will still sync up to the Bitcoin chain, and I will still be able to use it. It's been 10 years. Ethereum would be unrecognizable. It used to use proof of work. It was something else. It's changing. The network is changing and evolving, which is a nice property to have for a computing platform. Yeah. It is not a nice property to have for a monetary asset that needs to be durable and stable.
And I think some would say that maybe its performance is really not that great for a chain that changes as much as it has, right?
I think that decision is actually fundamental, right? Like it's not a short-term decision or some engineering work or anything like that. I think there's a fundamental tension between a network that decides that it's not going to change and it's going to be durable versus something that almost by definition has to change and adapt and improve if you want to be a computing platform. So the simplest way to think of this is that Solana might end up being a better computing platform because they have picked their lane. They're saying we are building a platform for developers, which is going to be fast and it is going to have these features. And Bitcoin has picked a lane to say that, hey, we're going to be a monetary asset. We don't care. We're not gonna change the L1, right? And Ethereum is in the middle, and I think they need to pick which side do you want to be on, and what do you want to compete with? Because otherwise, you would never be a asset better than BTC, and you might get beaten out on the platform side by a Solana or some other product.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ETH maxis that would have a different opinion on this, but I certainly understand what you're saying there. So then let me ask you, and by the way, I realize I'm probably pronouncing your name wrong. It's Muneeb, right?
Yeah, Muneeb
I'm
is
like saying it, I'm like emphasizing it incorrectly. But is there a world where I can use essentially a BTC network DEX? Is that coming?
It's coming. Some of them are already live. You can check out Alex. So it's built on stacks. And I think the thing that is missing from Alex right now is like faster speeds, which are coming from Nakamoto Release, and then a lot of BTC liquidity. Right. So think of this as
the Nakamoto Release is the update for stacks that you were just talking about.
Yes.
Okay.
So going back to the earlier conversation about being a Bitcoin monetary maxi. So the way I look at this is BTC is the best asset. And then any advances in the technology side, right, can be brought to Bitcoin as L2s. So the simplest way to envision this is a Solana-like system that is fast, that is cheap, but the asset is BTC and it's running as a Bitcoin L2. Like that's what we are building. But I think over there, the belief is that BTC, the asset, will remain the primary asset, but the technology will keep getting upgraded. Whatever stacks is today, it's not going to be this system like 3 years from now or 5 years from now. Whatever the latest technology and speeds and things that the industry is now used to, you can bring them to the Bitcoin L2. But the thing that would always stay valuable is BTC, the asset.
What about interoperability with other chains?
It's an interesting world, right? Like it's basically, they're almost like three different camps, right? Like one camp is the Bitcoin camp that I'm in, and Bitcoin L2s are very small right now. Like ETH L2s are something like $60 billion. Bitcoin L2s are like 3 billion, and maybe stacks is like 90%, right? It's a very small market right now. And I think it can grow a lot more. So that's one camp. The other camp is this world where people think that some ecosystem, like maybe either Ethereum or Solana or something else, becomes the primary hub, right? Like Ethereum, it probably has in the recent years had the best shot at it. And then the third world is what Cosmos or Polkadot are sort of like envisioning, that, hey, lots of different chains, but they're interconnected really well together. I think maybe Cosmos is the market leader there currently. So I think these are the three camps that I think of. And I think it's possible that some version of this exists, right? Like there's some success for each model. That maybe there are certain applications that work really well in an interconnected world. And Bitcoin, the asset, is not going anywhere. So that has a lot of gravitational pull, right? But I think it's too early to call that out of these three, like what exactly is going to happen. But what I know for sure is right now, not enough developers and not enough capital is coming to explore the Bitcoin world. And that changed in 2023, right? Like it started to flip. More capital is coming in, more developers are coming in. But still, like if you look at the three categories, I think the Bitcoin one is interestingly the least explored.
I guess people just have this idea that you can't do this with Bitcoin, right?
Yes. And I think it came from how it came directly with the rise of Ethereum, right? Which is sort of like strange to me because most of these new applications that got a lot of users, they actually started on Bitcoin, right? And in many ways, I feel like Bitcoin doesn't get the credit. Ethereum deserves the credit for taking NFTs more mainstream, but NFTs did not start on Ethereum. They started on Bitcoin with Counterparty, right? Like it's history. It's like history in the blockchain, right? People can go and look it up. In 2015, before Ethereum was even born, there are NFTs that are in the Bitcoin chain. I think similarly, even stablecoins, a lot of people think of like, oh, stablecoins started on Ethereum and then they became popular. No, Tether launched with Omni layer on Bitcoin, right? Like that's where stablecoins come from. Same thing with, even ICOs. Like a lot of people think that Ethereum started ICOs and that no, Ethereum popularized ICOs. Like there was Mastercoin or colored coins on Bitcoin. So a lot of these ideas actually started on Bitcoin. I would go to the extent that it would be hard to find ideas that didn't start in Bitcoin, right? Like most of the big ones, they actually started on Bitcoin. And then what happened is that with the rise of Ethereum, there was this narrative that was built that, oh, you can't do anything on Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just a pet rock, right? It's just a pet rock. It is just an asset. You can do anything on Bitcoin. And I think that narrative coincides with the rise of Ethereum. And the interesting thing that happened in 2013 with Ordinals, so there were small pockets of people like us who were like, no, Bitcoin can do a lot of things, and especially with L2s, it can. But I think with Ordinals, what happened is it's more like, show, don't tell. With Ordinals, it was like, look, this is happening on the L1. The fees are going up, right? Like we have seen like a 200x increase in Bitcoin fees, and that's in everyone's face now. Anyone who tries to use the Bitcoin network goes like, why are the fees so high? And the answer is, oh, people are doing BRC20s, which are like assets, or they're doing NFTs, which are ordinals, right? So then there is no doubt that, oh, Bitcoin can do these things. So I think that was a very interesting shift that happened this year.
I love this. Yeah, this has been such a good conversation. We're right kind of up at that point of where the length that I like for these conversations. Are there any closing thoughts that you want to share, or anything in particular you want to talk about or mention?
Yeah, I think just to build up on what we talked about, like my message to any developers or entrepreneurs is a little bit like, you want to be where the puck is going and not where it has been. And I think if you look at the fundamental argument here, you either want to be in a rising ecosystem like Solana, right? That is at least focused in what they want to do. Or you want to be in an early ecosystem like Bitcoin L2s, where there is blue ocean, and any application that you pick that is working in some other ecosystem, just use BTC as the asset and come and use it.
Love it. All right, Muneeb, thank you so much for being with us today.
All right, awesome. Thanks a lot.
That's all for today, folks. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe to The Blueprint on whatever channel you accessed us from. And even better, give us a like or a comment as well. If you're interested in going deeper on your crypto learning journey, check out XD Academy's collection of crypto masterclasses on xd.academy. We have an incredible course on the economics of Bitcoin live now by none other than Saifedean Amos, author of the Bitcoin Standard. All course registrants and completers are eligible for token rewards, so make sure to get your hands in that pie as well. We also have a growing community on the XD Academy Discord, which we'd love you to join. And if you like having positive conversations about crypto in a supportive and safe environment, I think you're going to feel really at home. Great seeing you guys. Until next time.